Good evening. My name is Donald Ross, and on behalf of my colleagues on the board of the Salisbury Forum, I want to welcome you to our second program of this 2017-18 season. And before continuing with some remarks, I want to recognize the presence of a distinguished guest, Senator James Buckley. When he heard that Akhil was going to be speaking tonight, he rushed over and is here with us. So there you are. Just raise your hand. The forum is honored to have Akhil read Amar with us. He is a sterling professor of law and politics at Yale University. And as many of you know who have heard him speak here before, he is a terrific speaker, but he is also a record-setting speaker in that this is his 5th appearance at the Salisbury Forum. So thank you for coming. At the conclusion of the program, as we do at every forum, two members of the board will be walking up and down the aisles and up to the balcony area with microphones. So if you have a question for the speaker, and it's going to be a long Q&A period, feel free to raise your hand, make the question as concise as possible so that enough other people will have a chance to speak. As usual, excuse me. After tonight's talk, Akhill, Professor Amar, will be on the stage able to sign books. He has a series of different books. The most recent one is The Constitution Today. Lastly, if you filled out forms that came in the program with requests for your names and email names and addresses, please turn them in. As you leave the auditorium, there'll be people with bags open to accept them. The reason we ask you to do this is so that we're able to keep you in contact and informed of various forum events. So with that, Professor Amar, welcome for the 5th time. Appreciate your time.
Thank you all for coming. It's great to almost see some of you. It's a little dark. I am touched that you all came, but truthfully, I know that you came most of all, not for me, but for the Constitution. You're interested in it. It's what we all have in common as Americans, whether we're red or blue, whether we're coastal or from the proverbial heartland. So, and I'm acutely aware that your time is precious, and so you're giving me your most precious resource, but I'm greedy. I want more of it. So here's how. What I'm hoping to do, we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to try to get into questions and answers much earlier than is perhaps customary because I want to talk about what you want to talk about. I brought a few slides, and depending on the questions you ask, one or more of these slides, there are about 20 in all, may become relevant. So I'll just prime the audience a little bit with a few of these. But here's what I really want. Because again and again, in answer to the questions that I expect you will be asking me, I can give you a very short answer, but not a fully satisfactory answer, in part because a full answer includes not just my conclusions, but all the reasons for it. So you're entitled to judge for yourself whether these reasons are good ones. Now, the reasons are contained in various books that I have written, and you don't have to buy them. That's not what I'm asking you to do. You have to read them. That's even worse than buying them. They're very inexpensive, but reading them, they're very time-consuming. So I want to get into your head. I'm like a virus, you see, and I need basically a human host. Your brain. I've got to get in between your ears. I want to get, so to speak, into your house and in your parlor, wherever you do your reading. We won't go any further than that. There may be other rooms where you do reading. So, in answer to various questions, I may tell you about this book or that one that contains more elaboration on a particular issue. If the books are a little too, and again, you don't have to buy them, but I do want you to read them. If that's a little too intense, here's an intermediate experience, because I want to spend more time with you. How many of you have heard of a MOOC? M-O-O-C. Okay, a MOOC is it's a new technology, a massive open online course. And by massive and open, I mean the label means to suggest these are things that are available to the world. And they're free. They're open and massive, and they're online. There are a series of video courses that Yale University has produced in cooperation with an organization called Coursera, C-O-U-R-S-E-R-A. The outgoing president of Coursera is Rick Levin, who was president of Yale University. And in partnership with Coursera, Yale has produced a whole series of Yale courses free to the world. I've done 2 of them. And you can sign up at any time, and you will get basically a 13-week series of video lectures. There are 2 courses. One is about America's written Constitution. It tracks a certain book that I'll talk about. And you've heard me talk about this on previous occasions here, America's Constitution, a Biography. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a minute. But this book walks you, the reader, it's 600 pages. It'll take you a month, at least. I'm greedy, I want your time. It walks you, the reader, through the written Constitution from start to finish. The preamble, we the people do ordain and establish the Constitution. Article 1, the legislature, its structure and powers. Article 2, the executive branch. No one's interested in the executive today, of course, but sometimes, people have been in American history. Article 3, the judiciary. Article 4, the states and territories. Articles 5, 6, and 7 are about the supremacy of the Constitution. And then I take you through the amendments, which are added chronologically as so many postscripts and postscripts, a careless written letter, as it were. Oh, like a Columbo episode. Oh, and another thing. Oh, and another thing. Oh, yeah, there's this other thing, too. So I take you, the reader, in the last third of the book through the Bill of Rights in the founding era, the first 10 amendments, and a couple that followed shortly thereafter in the early Federalist and Jeffersonian period. And then there's a hiatus, and then I'll take you through the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, 14th Amendment guaranteeing equal citizenship for blacks, 15th Amendment voting rights for blacks, the Progressive Era amendments of the 19-teens that you all remember when you were young adults. No, just income tax, direct election of senators, women's suffrage. The 1960s amendments that we do all remember, that we lived through, including an 18-year-old vote. So that book takes you through the written Constitution from start to finish. But if the book is a little too intense, there's this MOOC, this 13-week set of free online videos, 3 lectures a week, each one about 20 minutes, and it will walk you through the book and in the process walk you through the written Constitution. The second MOOC that's available tracks a sequel book called America's Unwritten Constitution. And the MOOC is about what I call America's Unwritten Constitution. And for lots of folks, them's fighting words. What do you mean unwritten, professor? You Yale professor, are you just making stuff up? And I hope I'm not. But here's the point, and that's why I wrote a whole book on the written Constitution, to persuade you, my fellow citizens, that I do take this terse text very seriously indeed, and so should you, this thing that we all have in common. But this terse text doesn't say the rule of law in so many words. It doesn't say separation of powers. Doesn't say checks and balances, doesn't say federalism, and yet all of those things are part of our constitutional system, as is the principle of one person, one vote, the idea that no person can be a judge in his own case. Beneath and behind the words of this terse text are, to borrow a phrase, postulates which limit and control, deep ideas unifying and making sense of the words. So we have to, the words of this text don't say separate is inherently unequal. It doesn't even say the Bill of Rights, although we call it the Bill of Rights, but it doesn't call itself a Bill of Rights. And why might it matter if it were actually a coherent unit, a bill, rather than a whole series of separate provisions? So America's Unwritten Constitution invites you, the book, the reader, to go beneath, beyond, and behind the words while trying to remain faithful to the words. The challenge is, are there tools and techniques of constitutional interpretation that aren't literalistic, but that nevertheless keep faith with a written Constitution? And the book will walk you through different ways of understanding the Constitution, not literally perhaps, but faithfully. And if the book is a little too intense for you, it's another 500 plus pages. The MOOC would be maybe just a slightly gentler introduction to these themes. I'll tell you, for example, how that book begins, and then I'll tell you about a couple of more books and the most recent one, and then we'll get into Q&A. I begin with a law joke, not a lawyer joke. I don't tell lawyer jokes because lawyers don't think they're funny, and ordinary people don't think they're jokes. So here's a law joke, and we'll see who laughs first. If you read this text literally, who presides at Mike Pence's impeachment trial? Who presides at the vice president's impeachment trial according to the literal words of this document? And I hope someone is beginning to giggle, because the text says that the Senate tries all impeachments, that body where Jim Buckley was once a member, okay? The Senate tries all impeachments, and the vice president is the presiding officer of the Senate. And there are a couple of exceptions. When the president is impeached, the Chief Justice presides, but in my hypothetical, it's the vice president who's being impeached. And when the vice president isn't there, a president pro tem presides, but in my hypothetical, the vice president is right there. He says, I'd like the gavel, please. I know I'm in the dock. I know I'm the defendant, but please hand me the gavel. I happen to be in the room. And can it truly be the case that the vice president would preside at his own impeachment trial? I suggest not. But if I can persuade you in the first 10 pages of this book, which was written a long time ago, way before Mike Pence, that the vice president doesn't preside at his own impeachment trial, I persuaded you that sometimes the Constitution read faithfully actually doesn't just mean more than what it means literally, but maybe even almost the opposite of what it seems to say literally if read in a flat-footed way. And if I've done that, I've just sawn a lady in half before your eyes, and you should be very worried, and I am too, because what the heck are the rules if you can make words turn into their opposites? And I am not a deconstructionist. I believe in faithful interpretation, but now how you see why you're going to have to spend some time trying to think about how how to read the Constitution in a way that's faithful but not quite literal sometimes, because there is an unwritten Constitution accompanying the written. Here's maybe the most interesting and important thing to think about for an unwritten Constitution. What are the rules of interpretation of the written text? Because the Constitution doesn't comprehensively identify how we are supposed to interpret its words. That itself is to some extent unwritten. And I think there are proper ways of going about engaging the task of interpretation. Okay, so that's America's Constitution, and there's a MOOC associated with it, and America's Unwritten Constitution, and there's a MOOC associated with it. Well, what game am I playing? I'm going to tell you just about the other books and the most recent one, and then Q&A. I'm trying in everything that I write to get you, the reader, my fellow citizens, to remember that it is, to borrow a phrase from John Marshall, a constitution we're construing, a whole system, not a sentence, not a clause, not a word, the system that is the American Constitution. So I'm trying to write panoramic books, books that are going to talk about rights and structure. They're going to talk about the founding and the Reconstruction and the 20th century and maybe to some extent the present moment. They're going to often books tell you about what things that are in the Constitution and actually things that aren't in the Constitution. They seek to be comprehensive and panoramic, but each one does so from a different perspective, a different point of view. America's Constitutional Biography takes the textual perspective and walks you through the document. America's Unwritten Constitution is about tools and techniques of interpretation, methods of constitutional analysis, not all of which are literalistic. Well, there's another book. It came out a couple of years ago. It's called The Law of the Land. And it's a geographic examination of the Constitution. 12 chapters, each one talking about a different state, and telling you a story about the Constitution, about from the perspective of that state, some person or case or an idea particularly associated with that state, because ours is a vast republic. This book is an ode to federalism, if you will. The Constitution actually does look different, actually, when examined from the point of view of different states that joined the Union at different times, sometimes with different perspectives. Chapter 1 of this book is about my hero Abraham Lincoln and how his vision is very much an Illinois Midwestern vision, that he is a product of his place. And to understand Lincoln is to understand the Midwest and vice versa. Chapter 2 of the book, there's not a MOOC associated with this. This book is a little bit more like the Dubliners, Canterbury Tales. It's a sort of a series of connected, the Nick Adams stories. It's sort of a thematic short story, sort of connected together. Chapter 2 is about the American Southland, which gave us, I believe, one of the great justices of the 20th century, unsung, Hugo Lafayette Black, senator from Alabama, same state that gave us Jeff Sessions, and who knows who will be the next senator from Alabama. That's an interesting thing that we're all watching with great interest. Interesting question. So chapter 3 is about a justice from New York, Robert Jackson, a particularly interesting and stylish justice in the 20th century. Chapter 4 is about the current swing justice on the court, Anthony Kennedy. I'm from Northern California, so is he. In interesting ways, he has a California sensibility. He's part Ronald Reagan, but also part Earl Warren, who was a famous Californian. And Earl Warren and Ronald Reagan were two different kinds of Californians, and Anthony Kennedy is interestingly poised between them. And other chapters are going to tell you about other states and other events or ideas or personalities. So as I said, it tries to be panoramic, but in a different way, a geographic way. And in case you missed it, America did divide geographically in some very interesting ways in the last election. This image shows a couple of interesting geographic takes. That's an interesting geographic division that we could talk about. This is another way of looking at America's geographic divisions, and if people want to ask me questions about, for example, the Electoral College and what it's really all about, I can tell you what some of those pictures, what the story that those pictures tell, which is a very geographic story. Or just to pick something from the headlines, Neil Gorsuch, I think, is a particularly interesting person because you see all the justices, all of them basically went to law school in the Northeast. They all went to Harvard or Yale. Ruth Bader Ginsburg also went to Columbia. But Gorsuch, more than the others, brings a little bit of the heartland onto the court from Colorado. He spent his youth part of his youth in Washington, D.C., so he's a coastal kid, but also a heartland kid. And America did divide in the last election between the coasts and the heartland, and there are interesting perspectives, I think, on American constitutional law that you can get if you think about things geographically, with attention to federalism and the distinct experiences and perspectives of 50 distinct states. That brings me to the most recent book. I'll just tell you a little bit about it. It's called The Constitution Today. It collects op-eds that I've written over the last 20 years for the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times and Slate about really the issues of our era. The other books are a little bit more history books to some extent. And this book is more of a current affairs, current events book. It's you don't have to read it start to finish. Your kids will like this just because it's a big bag of Oreo cookies. It's 80 essays, short, each short and sweet, so you're never too far from the end of any given essay. And let me just tell you a little bit about it, because as I said, it's more of a current events book. And I timed it was released in September of 2016 because I thought that election that we were entering into was going to be perhaps the most momentous of my lifetime. And I think, I, if anything, may have underestimated what it was about. But here's one way of thinking about why that election was so fraught, and we're maybe not quite aware of it. Remember, I want to give you a panoramic story. I want to tell you about the judiciary, of course, but not just the judiciary. The Constitution is about all the branches. So I told you about Hugo Black. He was a senator and a justice, for example. Robert Jackson was in the executive branch as Attorney General, and then he became a Supreme Court justice. Here's what was interesting about 2016 that I anticipated. I thought this is the first time, maybe since Lincoln, where every single organ of federal power is realistically in play. As of September, it was realistically possible that the Democrats could have won the House, the Senate, the presidency, and the judiciary. And it was also realistically possible for the Republicans to sweep all four, which they did. That hasn't been true since Abraham Lincoln, because of the way the different branches are actually sequenced. When Abraham Lincoln wins, for example, in 1860, there's no way he's going to win the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is dominated by the ghosts of Democratic presidential predecessors who have stacked the court, ghosts of Jacksonian justices past. Dred Scott is 7-2, and Abraham Lincoln, even if he wins the House, which he doesn't, and if he wins the Senate, which he doesn't, is never going to carry the Supreme Court. Now, 1864, actually, it's pretty closely balanced, and if McClellan had won, it would have been a very different world. Lincoln's party could have won all the branches, or McClellan's, and a lot was up for grabs. But Lincoln wins re-election. And by the time he wins re-election, and then Grant wins, the court's now no longer in play. The Republicans are dominant. After having never won a presidential election, the Republicans dominate the presidency from 1860 to 1932. No Democrat in that whole period ever gets a popular majority. Not Woodrow Wilson, not Grover Cleveland, who doesn't even win consecutive majorities. So the court is not in play from 1868 to 1932. And when Franklin Roosevelt wins in 32, the court isn't in play. It's dominated by ghosts of Republicans past. And so now by 1936 and 1940, the court begins to be in play. But by then, the Democrats have a total lock on the House of Representatives. They pretty much dominate the House of Representatives all the way to the Gingrich Revolution. So maybe the court was in play for a brief period, but the House wasn't, in fact. So that's one of the reasons this was so fraught. Here's what could have happened. If Hillary Clinton had won, she would have carried the Senate. Because if she had won, she's winning in states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and New Hampshire, and there's very little ticket splitting today. So if she's winning in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, then the Democratic candidates for the Senate in those states are winning, and then she gets the Senate. You see, she gets the Senate, she carries the presidency, she gets the court, because that's Merrick Garland or someone else is going to be confirmed, you see. So, and she could have won the House of Representatives as well. Contrary-wise, what happened? Because Donald Trump carried the presidency, and he also carried the Senate in these key states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. He gets the court because Garland goes down and it's Neil Gorsuch. The court was in play in 2016. For my entire adult lifetime, Republican appointees have had a majority on the Supreme Court since 1970, basically. So the court realistically hasn't been in play. It was in 2016. You were voting on that whether you were aware of it or not. So 2016 was a really interesting election, I thought. Maybe the most important. I saw it coming, going forward. That's one of the reasons there was so much anxiety, that so much was up for grabs, because usually not everything is up for grabs. Everything was up for grabs. My side lost. And not just actually House, Senate, Judiciary, and Presidency, but actually in a lot of states as well. And I think my side has to do a lot of rethinking, truth be told. Now, the book walks you through the branches. Chapter 1 is about the presidency. And I talk in particular about some interesting aspects of how the framers were designing the presidency, very much thinking about the idea of dynasty. And so if you have questions about presidents and dynasty, and I'm not just talking about the Clintons, nor am I just talking about the Bushes, we could talk about the Gores, we could talk about the Kennedys, we could talk about, see, Andrew Cuomo, he's not just that his father was governor of New York. He was married to Robert Kennedy's daughter, and it's not just that Arnold Schwarzenegger is a famous movie actor. He was married to Maria Shriver, whose dad ran for the vice presidency, whose uncle was president, whose other uncle ran for the presidency, whose other uncle ran for the presidency. So it's everywhere, and you're not maybe fully aware of it. Chapter 1 is about the presidency and dynasty. Chapter 2 is about the vice presidency. It's subtitle, borrowing from John Adams, is Nothing But Maybe Everything. And people today are very interested, apparently, in the 25th Amendment. Oh, I have lots of stuff on the 25th Amendment and presidential succession in that chapter. If you're interested, we could talk about it. I think our presidential succession system is actually a disaster waiting to happen, and if you ask me about that, I'll tell you why. Chapter 3, and you don't have to buy the book, but there are libraries out there. You can read it. And I can't go into all the details today, but these are the issues of our era. See, look, if you vote for Bush and Cheney, you should never, if God forbid there were an assassination or something, a politically inspired assassination, you should never end up with Nancy Pelosi. You just shouldn't. And that's not partisan, because if you vote for Obama and Biden, you shouldn't end up with John Boehner. Really? And every single president since Lyndon Johnson, except Jimmy Carter, has had an opposition leader as Speaker of the House, except Trump, it's too soon to tell, but that may very well happen in 2018. And it's bad when you vote for one party and get the other party. That's just not a good system, and I'll tell you other reasons it's not a good system in addition to that one. So Chapter 2 is about the presidential succession system and the pivotal role that the vice president plays. Not so pivotal that he would preside at his own impeachment trial, but pivotal. Chapter 3 is about a very dysfunctional branch, the Congress of the United States. I have some suggested reforms. I'll talk about the nuclear option, the so-called filibuster reform. I actually was in favor of the nuclear option, and I'll tell you why and what it was really about. It was originally a Republican idea, and I was in favor of it when they floated it, and I'm still in favor of it. It would help the Republican Party today. I'm not a Republican, but constitutional law is not supposed to be partisan, you see. So I can talk about, if you're interested in filibuster reform, happy to talk about that in Chapter 3, how to fix a broken branch. It's about congressional oversight and other things. Chapter 4 is about the judiciary and who judges the judges. In the first instance, it's actually law professors, and ultimately it's you all. You do it in part when presidential elections. You pick presidents and senators, and presidents and senators pick judges and justices. So we all judge the judges, and there's some meditations on how to think about judging the judiciary. Just to briefly tell you what the other chapters are, because I think I've now, because I want to get you in the conversation. I've spoken long enough. I think they said you have to talk for 20 minutes, so I think I've talked for about that. The other chapters. A whole section on culture wars, criminal procedure from OJ to DNA, citizens disunited, race, guns, gays, and more. So we can talk about same-sex marriage, and we can talk about affirmative action and the Second Amendment, and that citizens disunited, yes. Happy if you want to ask me about Citizens United. I'll defend the decision. And a decision called Buckley v. Vallejo, another Buckley perhaps, but still. I won't give you always the liberal line all the way on this stuff. So if you're interested, I'll tell you what's right about Citizens United in my view. And then the book ends with 3 what I call presidential dramas. Presidents are drama queens, drama kings. Each of our last 3 presidents, I think, had one particular issue a constitutional issue that historians will particularly remember. For Bill Clinton, it was his partisan impeachment. For George Bush, it was the odd way in which he originally came to power through the Electoral College and the Bush v. Gore case. For Barack Obama, it was that statute that bears his name, Obamacare, that remains constitutionally controversial. So for each of the last 3 presidents, I'm going to tell you about the big constitutional issue of that presidency, Obamacare, the Electoral College for George W. Bush, and the Clinton impeachment. Okay, so I think I've told you kind of what's in the book. I want to get your questions, so we have people with microphones, and let the conversation begin.
Okay, let's just remember it's questions. Big Jeopardy.
So I'd like you to talk about all of them, but 2 things come to mind: gerrymandering.
Yep.
And felons not being allowed to vote.
Great.
Please do.
So, we Democrats have to understand why we lost. And we didn't lose in the main because of gerrymandering. Okay? And I know that's what you've been taught. So, there was voter suppression in several places. North Carolina, people were purged from the rolls. Texas and the Electoral College, you weren't going to win anyway. North Carolina was much closer. There are problems of voter suppression. Voter suppression isn't going to explain quite, though, among the people who did vote, why Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, let's say, and didn't win the Electoral College. We need something else to explain some of that. Gerrymandering is an issue. It's an issue in about 5 states, 5 or 6 states particularly. Texas, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina. There might be one more. But here's the reason in the main that Republicans overperform and Democrats underperform. What do I mean by over and underperformance? I mean that if Democrats get X% of the legislative vote statewide, they get fewer than X% of the they win fewer than X% of the districts, both in the state legislature and in the Congress. And the main reason for this is that we Democrats cluster in cities. We've chosen to live and here's this will show you just a little bit. Hold on. So let's just take a look at this. This is a recent presidential election map by county. And when Democrats are winning cities 80-20, we're, in political science parlance, wasting a lot of votes. We only needed to win at 51-49. So we're winning it overwhelmingly, and that's a lot of voters who, if they had been in some other district, could have helped some other Democrat win some other race, but they're not. So we're winning 80-20, and we're losing a whole bunch of other districts, rural districts, 55-45. That means the Republicans are wasting fewer votes than the Democrats. What's a wasted vote? A vote that goes to a loser, someone who loses. I'm not using it in the Trumpian sense. Someone who doesn't win the election, maybe a very decent person, maybe the better person, but someone who, or a wasted vote is someone who goes to a losing candidate, or a vote that goes to a winning candidate above what that person needed to win, anything above 51 out of 100. Democrats waste a lot more votes because actually we cluster in cities. This is not unique to the United States. It's true in New Zealand. It's true in Britain. Urban parties tend to underperform. Just to make the math easy just in your head, imagine a state. It could be New York. It could be Pennsylvania. It's got a couple of big cities. So James Carville defined Pennsylvania as Philadelphia and Pittsburgh connected by northern Alabama. In New York, you're talking about Albany, Buffalo, New York City, and then everything else. Okay, so just to make the math easy, imagine that the big cities are 40% of the statewide population, and the rest is 60%. Okay, and imagine that the urban party, the Democratic Party, is winning 80% in the cities and winning 40% elsewhere. Okay, well, you do the math. You win 80% of the cities, 0.8 times 0.4, 40, that's 32% of the state right there. And you're winning 40% of the rest, 0.4 times 0.6, that's 26, 32. You're winning the state overwhelmingly. And you're losing 60% of the districts. Okay, and that's not because of gerrymandering. In order to prevent that, in order to create no efficiency gap, which is what these is being pushed at the Supreme Court, and I'm with John Roberts in thinking this is actually legally gobbledygook, even though it would help my party. But in order to actually say, if you win 56% of statewide votes, you should have 56% of the congressional districts. Just to take New York City, you'd have to draw a whole bunch of districts that look like this. It'd sort of be pie slices, and the center of the pie is Columbus Circle, okay? Sort of, right where Central Park begins or something. And we have a little slice, it's 7 feet wide, and it goes, up through Harlem, and the South Bronx, and halfway to Poughkeepsie or Albany before you capture enough Republicans so it's actually cross-section of the state, 55-45. That's going to look like a weird district. And those people have nothing in common. They've chosen to live apart from each other. There's not a compactness, a community of interest. So That's why we're losing, because sane people like me choose to live in cities. So it's not gerrymandering that's really the root of the problem. Felon disenfranchisement, oh, that's a problem. And the 14th Amendment, Section 2, seems to contemplate felon disenfranchisement, so it's part of the Constitution itself. There are at least two aspects of felon disenfranchisement, maybe three. One, many states disfranchise people while they are currently in prison. And it's going to be hard to do secret ballot in a prison. There are going to be some complications. But there's a second issue about once you've finished your prison time, that's ex-felon disenfranchisement something, and some states do it, and many states actually don't. There's a third issue. And a third issue is, even if you are franchised, should you be counted as living in your real home district, or should you be counted as actually living in this place where the prison is? A whole bunch of people are actually, in states like New York, sometimes in Texas, counted as living in rural areas. They don't get to vote. They're actually padding the voting power of the people who do get to vote in those areas. The people who are in prison are sort of black and vote one way. The overseers, the guards in the local community is very different, and it looks a little like the 3/5 clause, you see, where you have all these slaves and they're not quite voting, and they're, but they're padding the voting power of those who do. And it raises some issues about where we should, even if we don't let them vote, where we should count them. Should their true residence be actually the place that they came from and they're going to go to after their prison term, or should it be where the prison is located, which is often in a rural area? That's a real issue in America. Hiya.
In 2016, it's looking like U.S. citizens were hit with a massive propaganda campaign and possibly a hacked vote count. Is there no solution to a hacked election? As there is no solution to a hacked election in the Constitution, is SCOTUS limited to solutions from the Constitution, or may they use some other method to find a solution to this? And if they do decide that it is a hacked election, would a nullification be possible?
So I'm going to be hesitant. I voted for her, in case you missed it. She was actually at Yale a couple of days ago, and I was at a birthday party for her. We sang her happy birthday. She blew out the candles, and I opened my eyes, and no, it wasn't a dream. I was kind of hoping, it was just, she'd blow out those candles, and I'd be back to, October of 2016 or something, but no such luck. Okay. But that said, no. SCOTUS should not be in the business of trying to undo presidential elections. In the Constitution, presidents pick justices. Justices don't pick presidents. That's why in this book I'm going to tell you that Bush versus Gore stank. I didn't like it because I actually didn't think judges should be deciding contested political elections. In our constitutional tradition, in 1800, it was close between Adams between Jefferson and Burr. The Supreme Court didn't intervene. Congress decided. In 1876, Hayes-Tilden, the Supreme Court didn't formally intervene. Congress decided. They actually asked a few justices to volunteer to help arbitrate that, but they weren't sitting as a Supreme Court. In 1824, with Andrew Jackson, here he is, our friend Andrew Jackson. Oh, no, that's President Trump. No, that is President Jackson. Okay. I always get them confused. King Andrew I, when he is running against this Secretary of State who's very popular, but people don't like her. I mean him, John Quincy Adams. See, it's the same thing. John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. History repeating itself in some interesting ways. But the Supreme Court didn't get involved in 1824, and it didn't get involved in 1876, 77, and it didn't get involved in 1800. And when it did get involved with Bush and Gore, I thought it actually overstepped its role. So the Supreme Court should butt out. Second, well, if an election is hacked such that actually the machines were broken into and she actually won Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, well, that would be very interesting. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I want to see some evidence. We have too many conspiracy theories. If the point is that the Russians were trying to do all sorts of propaganda, to support one side, I say, with all due respect, shame on the voters for being stupid and listening to that. There's actually free speech in the country, and you get to decide whom you listen to, whether it's some, stupid thing or you have to decide. You are sovereign citizens, and we can't blame the Russians for Americans on election day, one person, one vote, secret ballot, voting for someone we didn't like. We have to blame ourselves. And we can say, ooh, there's some felon disenfranchisement, and is that fair? It's constitutional. Whether we should do it or not, I think, is a real issue. And it's not because of gerrymandering, because all these electoral votes are statewide votes. It has nothing to do with congressional districts. Our side didn't show up, and a bunch of people are choosing to believe all sorts of kind of ridiculous claims in a media that has been hollowed out because it's hard to make money in the information business. The business model has collapsed. But no, I do not blame the Russians. I do not blame the founders. So what's the solution? It's called the next election. And there'll be an election after that, God willing, and one after that. And that's how the system works.
Can you tell me about strict constructivism? It sounds black and white, but any time a decision is made that is strict, it's inevitably a matter of interpretation. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I tend not to use the phrase strict construction. I tend, in general, except when I'm being a little bit playful and puckish, not to use phrases like judicial activism because the baselines need to be specified and often they're not, and sometimes those are just epithets for a decision I don't like. And so I tend not to use those formulations. That said, if I'm trying to explain most charitably what people who believe themselves to be strict constructionists actually believe, here's, I think, the most charitable way of understanding what they're saying. They tend to be folks who pay particular attention to the text and the history and the structure of the Constitution itself, as opposed, for example, to judicial case law, which may have departed quite considerably from the text. And the tension, one of the many tensions in American constitutional law, is that precedent is significant, but so is the text. Now, how do we think about something where the text seems to say one thing and the precedents seem to say another? I'm, in general, a text history and structure person. I say, this says equal. Segregation ain't equal. I know Plessy said it was okay, but the Constitution is the supreme law of the land and not the doctrine, the precedent. If there's basically a contradiction between what the Supreme Court has said, separate but equal is okay, and we don't really care that much about equal, which is what they said for a couple of generations, and what this says, which is that we're all equal citizens, born equal citizens, let's follow that strict construction. Now, although you've been taught, many of us, that's a right-wing meme idea. I don't think so at all. Let me tell you about my hero, Hugo Black, who is profiled. Chapter 1 is Lincoln, Chapter 2 is Hugo Black. And these are both Hicks from the sticks. Lincoln has less than a year's formal education in his whole life, and he is underestimated by the Ivy Leaguers. And the same thing happens to Hugo Black. He's a hick from the sticks. He didn't go to Harvard or Yale, as all the current justices, of course, did, you see. And he didn't even go to a real law school for 3 years. And sort of what does he know? And he's looked down on because he, speaks with a Southern drawl, as maybe Lincoln did himself. But Hugo Black, I think, is one of the great justices of the 20th century. And let me tell you what he does. And he's a strict constructionist. justice of a certain sort. He always carried a copy of the Constitution around with him wherever he went. What a weird fellow he was. Just what kind of person would carry multiple copies of the Constitution? I have several more here, with him. So, here's another one. There we go. Betsy DeVos gave me that one. This is from Grand Valley College. The DeVosses own the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan, basically. This one has President Trump. It's not partisan, you see. The Constitution belongs to all of us. So, Hugo Black. Here's what the world looked like the day before Franklin Roosevelt's first appointee to this court. Here's what the world looked like in 1936, before Hugo Black is appointed. There's massive segregation, apartheid, Jim Crow across much of America. But the document, you see, actually says equal. There's malapportionment in almost all states and massive malapportionment in many states, not equal-sized districts, not one person, one vote. But this actually talks about a right, and many blacks are disfranchised in the places where most blacks live, the American Southland. This document says multiple times the right to vote, 14th Amendment, Section 2, 15th Amendment, Section 2, 19th, Section 1, 19th Amendment, and then later on we'll repeat those words in the 24th and 26th Amendments. So, document says right to vote, court isn't doing it. Document says racial equality, we're not doing it. Document says freedom of speech and of the press. Freedom of speech and of the press have almost never prevailed in the United States Supreme Court as late as the 1930s, early 30s. The document says actually that the Bill of Rights is supposed to apply against state and local governments. That's the central meaning of the second sentence of the 14th Amendment, and yet that's not what courts are doing. The courts are not applying the Bill of Rights against the states. There's organized sectarian prayer in the public schools, which favors some denominations over others, reading a King James Bible, but they're not the Douay Bible, and what about people who happen not to be Christians or Jews? There's organized sectarian prayer in the schools, but this document says religious equality. And this document says criminal defendants have rights, like rights to counsel, but poor people don't have, for example, counsel. So what does Hugo Black do? Hugo Black actually says, it says equal, it says right to vote, it says freedom of speech, it says religious equality, it says racial equality, it says right of counsel. I'm going to take seriously what this says. That's a certain kind of strict construction. He, in my view, is the driving force of the Warren Court, the driving intellectual force. It was not Earl Warren. It was not William Brennan. Hugo Black is saying all these things, often in dissent, before Warren and Brennan even get on the court. You were taught the Warren Court made all this stuff up? No. I claim it's actually a certain kind of strict construction, if you will, favoring the Constitution over the precedents from the left. Now, here's what would be real progress, and actually I think we do have real progress. Conservatives used to say, impeach Earl Warren, we hate the Warren Court. That was bad. Today, actually, our best conservatives don't, even if they say that sometimes, they don't really mean it. They actually have come to make their peace with the Warren Court, and this is progress. They have conservative interpretations of some of what the Warren Court did, but we're all accepting the Warren Court just as we all accept the Constitution. Here's what they say. Brown versus Board of Education, we now think it's right, but we actually think people should be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Constitution should be colorblind. We don't love affirmative action, but we are disciples of Brown. Whereas, you see, at the time that Brown is decided, every single Southern senator signs a Southern manifesto saying this is outrageous. Every single senator from the former Confederacy signs a Southern manifesto except Estes Kefauver from Tennessee, who wants to be vice president, Al Gore, Sr. from Tennessee, who wants to be vice president, wants his son to be vice president, and Lyndon Johnson from Texas. That's it, who wants to be president. And they're from the peripheral South. Every other Southern senator from the Confederacy says Brown is horrible. Today, they don't say that. Conservatives say, yes, we believe in Brown and Martin King. We have a conservative interpretation. That's progress. What did Black say? Freedom of speech? Conservatives say, yes, we believe in that. That's Citizens United. But we believe in freedom of speech. Liberals said, apply the Bill of Rights against the states, apply speech and press and petition and assembly and council and double jeopardy. And conservatives say, fine, but let's also apply the Second Amendment against the states. Let's read it in individual rights way, but let's apply that against the states too. You say, liberals say in the Warren Court, religious equality, great, but let's not discriminate against religion. So the conservatives have actually accepted the terms of this Warren Court revolution, because it was a revolution, but from a certain point of view, you could call that strict construction. You could call that actually, it requires some interpretation, but paying attention to the document over the doctrine, the judicial case law. Now, there's going to be a lot of debate about, for example, Roe versus Wade. We're one vote away from overruling Roe versus Wade. If you want, because some people say it's not in the Constitution, if you want to read more on what to do when precedent seems to say one thing and the text seems to say another, that's Chapter 5 of America's Unwritten Constitution, which is called Putting Precedent in Its Place, because it's one of the deeper issues of American constitutional law. Chapter 4 of that book is all about the Warren Court Revolution, and Chapter 2 of this book is all about how Hugo Black deserves a place in the Hall of Fame, because he actually is a very underappreciated justice.
Question on Citizen United.
Great.
I think you answered it just now about freedom of speech.
Yeah. So let me defend Citizens United more than I have, because I think it's a very misunderstood decision. First, I have to give a shout out to Jim Buckley, because Citizens United is building on a very important earlier free speech case called Buckley versus Vallejo. And here's a fundamental distinction in Buckley versus Vallejo. Campaign contributions, giving money to candidates, are treated very differently. They can be regulated in all sorts of ways. That's different than, say, running an ad saying, vote for Smith, vote against Smith. Campaign money given to a candidate is different than running an ad saying, vote for or against so-and-so. I think that fundamental distinction makes sense, and Citizens United is based on it. Here are the facts of Citizens United. They're a bunch of people, they use the corporate form. They have a corporation, but they basically create a movie. And the movie is designed to tell people just how horrible Hillary Clinton is. Hillary the movie. Ooh, bad, she's bad. Did I tell you she's bad? That's what the movie is. Now, I don't think in America you can shut down a movie that's released near the time of election telling you that one candidate is good or bad. You say, that's the facts. The person in oral argument who was asked to defend the law said, well, could the government shut this down if it was a book? And actually, the lawyer for the government said, actually, I think it is the position of the government. They could. The person who argued that is a dear friend of mine, a former student. His name is Malcolm Stewart. But no, in America, you can't shut down people who publish books or create movies. And you say, ooh, professor, but it's a corporation. And I say, yeah, so is Random House. And please do at least read, if you do not buy, this Random House book. Thank God for the corporation called Random House, because I couldn't get my ideas out without that. By the way, last time I looked, the New York Times was a corporation, and so is Yale University, and so are all sorts of churches, and so is Dartmouth College. There's a very famous case about Dartmouth College being a corporation. Look, and you say, oh yeah, but the New York Times, that's different. That's a media corporation. Oh, that's different. So when they editorially endorse Hillary Clinton, that doesn't count as some sort of ad or expenditure. When they give her all sorts of favorable press coverage, and I'm a Hillary person, but that doesn't count. But somehow when ExxonMobil runs an ad and pays for it on the op-ed page of the New York Times, that counts as some sort of expenditure. Oh, I get it. So we're going to have now a distinction between media corporations and non-media corporations. How would that work? And even if we did, then the game simply becomes to become a media corporation, for ExxonMobil to buy the New York Times, or Jeff Bezos to buy the Washington Post. And by the way, he just became, I think, the richest guy in the world today because of Amazon's, he passed Bill Gates. Even if you could shut down corporations, and you shouldn't, I don't want Donald Trump to be able to shut down the New York Times because he doesn't like what they write, or to shut down the National Broadcasting Corporation because that's what NBC is, because he doesn't like, the coverage that they offer to him. But even if you could say, corporations can't actually tell you vote for Smith, vote for Jones, even if you said all of that, individuals could use their money, billionaires could use their money, right? It's their money. Vote for me, vote for my friend. And freedom of the press is free to people who own presses. And today everyone does. It's called a laptop, and you can get your memes out there. So, look, if you don't like what an ad is saying, don't believe it. Vote for the other person. Linda McMahon spent $1 gazillion twice in this state, and every ad she ran, I liked her less and less, and I got to vote against her, and I thought, is this a great country or what? She's pumping money into my state economy, and I get to vote against her. Because on election day, it's one person, one vote, secret ballot, and corporations don't vote. So if you are persuaded by the ads because you're weak-minded and you don't know, up from down, or the Russians, shame on you. You should be doing you're a sovereign citizen. Donald Trump spent nothing on ads early on. Jeb Bush, $80 million, look what it got him. Meg Whitman way outspent Jerry Brown. She's the eBay gazillionaire. Jerry Brown kicked her butt. Carly Fiorina, she's got lots of money, she had lots of ads, people don't like her. And the more ads she runs, the people still don't like her. There was this great meeting of these ads. They came up with the most brilliant campaign for dog food, brilliant ad campaign. And they won all the prizes. And somehow those sales are down, and they're having this meeting at some point saying, look, we won this prize and that one. It's a brilliant ad. What's the problem? And one guy says, listen, the ads are great, but the dogs won't eat the food. So look, I do not blame ads. Citizens have to decide. Now, why are campaign contributions different? That's money in a candidate's pocket. Yes, he can't actually use it for personal expenses quite, although in the old days he could even do that. Now he can't quite. But he's not using it just for ads. He can use it for pizza, for gasoline. He has to hire his worthless brother-in-law, basically, and put his worthless brother-in-law on the payroll. And otherwise his wife would nag him that he has to give his own money to support his worthless brother-in-law. My brother-in-law is perfectly fine. This is not a personal thing. But campaign contributions are very different. They're closer to bribes. They're not pure expression. Pure expression, ads only have an effect if voters decide that they're persuaded by them. And in a free society, I don't think you can shut down ads. So that's why I'm with the conservatives on Citizens United. And I'm not the only liberal who is. Floyd Abrams is. Kathleen Sullivan is. Larry Tribe is. Many people in the ACLU are. And once you know the facts of Hillary, on the facts, really, you want to say people can't have a movie basically saying vote against Hillary Clinton because she's bad? You have to be able to do that. And I thought the movie stank.
Professor, what about capital punishment? It's apparent across the states it's so uneven, with many states not allowing capital punishment, and yet some of the states, such as Texas and Mississippi, have a horrible record. Will the Supreme Court ever outlaw capital punishment?
If Hillary Clinton had won, Merrick Garland would have carried the Senate. And Merrick Garland, and even if she had lost, by the way, even if she had lost, if the Democrats had just carried the Senate, if they had somehow, if Katie McGinty had won in Pennsylvania and Ron Johnson had been defeated in Wisconsin, in the lame duck period, even if Hillary had lost, in the lame duck period, the Democrats could have, with the tie-breaking vote of Joe Biden, gotten Merrick Garland through, done a filibuster reform, nuclear option, got him through. And just for good measure, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Steve Breyer could have stepped down that week and been appointed by 25-year-old socialists who could have been jammed through. So if they played hardball and said, we're not going to give Garland a hearing, we could have done, we lost the election, okay? So if Garland had won, I think Steve Breyer was moving toward a position articulated in very separate opinions that the death penalty is basically unconstitutional across the board. He was making a pitch for Anthony Kennedy, and even without Kennedy, Merrick Garland would have been 5 Democrat appointees on the court for the first time in my adult lifetime since 1970. So it could have happened. That was on the ballot in the last election. That was in play. Now, not so much, at least for the moment. If you just ask me to count noses on the Supreme Court. Anthony Kennedy does have concerns about how the death penalty is administered in all sorts of ways. He also even has concerns about solitary confinement and other very harsh punishments. But Merrick Garland is not the 5th vote, as he would have been. The swing vote had Hillary won.
Hi.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, comparatively, like America's a fairly young country.
Yes.
Is there another country that is as constantly torn over their law of the land that we are? Are there people that are as stubborn about their original law of the land as we are?
So are there people who worship their Constitution to the same extent as Americans? And maybe not. I don't think the Canadians do, and if I'm going to be snarky here, but, I think Churchill once described someone as a modest man who has much to be modest about. So I think the Canadian Constitution is, even though it's substantively impressive, didn't change the world the way the United States Constitution did. So here's why I think instinctively we Americans actually are more Constitution worshiping, and I think we should be, because we actually, the problem is we don't know why, but there actually are good reasons. Here's why. The history of the world, all the way up until the American Revolution, is a history in which there are very few democracies ever in the world, and the ones that do exist, tiny little city-states, ancient Athens, pre-imperial Rome, Florence, people worshiping the same god or gods, speaking the same language, smaller than New Haven, Connecticut, no cold weather and warm weather people getting together, no multiple time zones, and they're not able to make a go of it, of democracy, for a very long time. And even at their best, they never put their constitutions to a vote of the people. The Cleisthenic Constitution, the Periclean Constitution in ancient Athens was not put to a vote. Rome never had a constitution sort of put to a vote. The Brits are self-governing, but they never reduce their principles to a text that Parliament endorsed, much less the British people. And even in 1776, Declaration of Independence not put to a vote. None of the state constitutions in 1776 was put to a vote. Articles of Confederation aren't put to a vote. And then Massachusetts and New Hampshire did in 1780 and 1784. Amazing, and that set the stage. That's the dress rehearsal, in retrospect. For up and down a freaking continent, we, the people of the United States, actually put the thing to a vote. See, and this is a newspaper, and it's printing the entire Constitution. This is September 19th, 1787. There's freedom of the press even before the First Amendment, you see. And it's possible that the Pennsylvania Packet used the corporate form, but that wouldn't disentitle them to actually publish what they want or not. And they're publishing the entire Constitution from start to finish because it's short, so ordinary people can read it. And if they don't, shame on them. You see, you can't blame the Russians or anyone else or corporations. You have to read the stuff and decide for yourself. But there's freedom of speech and of the press even before the First Amendment. That's an argument of an unwritten Constitution. Even before the First Amendment, freedom of the press is baked into this thing. Up and down the continent, we put the thing to a vote. For a whole year, ordinary Americans are in this conversation. and some fiercely support it, and some fiercely oppose it, and no one dies politically in that whole year. This is amazing. And the people who oppose it are not voted off the island. That's actually a technical Greek term. It's called ostracism, when you're voted off the Peloponnesus. And that's what happened in ancient Greece. But here, you oppose the Constitution, you can become President of the United States. James Monroe. Vice President of the United States, Elbridge Gerry. George Clinton, Governor of New York. Justice on the Supreme Court, Samuel Chase. You opposed the Declaration of Independence in 1776, you're never heard from again politically. You have two choices in 1776, because we're at war. You know, if you oppose the Declaration of Independence, here are your two choices. 1, leave. 2, shut up. Those are your only choices, because this is not a philosophy seminar. This is war. King of England has sent over 30,000 troops. They're going to slit our throats if we do not hang together. We will assuredly hang separately, by which Ben Franklin means hang by the neck until we are dead, and they're going to kill our women and children. It's not a philosophy seminar, so if you're not on board with us, leave or shut up. You're lucky we don't tar and feather you. For better or worse, that's 1776. But the Constitution is so much better than that. We put it to a vote, and people can be for it, and people can be against it, and they're actually talking to each other, and no one is killed politically. And actually, the Canadians never did anything like that, quite. That changed the world, because here's the world that you now live in. Before the Constitution, there's democracy almost nowhere on the planet. Today, by population and landmass, democracy prevails over half the planet. On an American model, we change the world. My parents are in India, 1 billion people. They have now a written constitution with free and fair elections and multiple political parties alternating in power, and a Bill of Rights and judicial review, and freedom of speech, and a dimension of religious toleration to a pretty impressive extent. And when my parents are born, my parents are still alive in undivided India, there was none of that. They were just taking orders from a king that no one voted for and a parliament that no one voted for, often in England, just like the American colonists were. That's 1 billion people in India. And we could talk about Japan and Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and that's because, which are democratic now. You know, France is a pretty impressive republic, almost as good as California, not quite. California treats its Muslims better than France does, and we have a higher GDP, and our wine isn't bad, and better universities. So the world is now American and democratic because of the American Constitution. So we Americans actually do have a lot to be proud of. We have a lot to be ashamed of, too, and I could talk about that. People haven't asked me about slavery and other stuff. But I don't think that there's Constitution worship to the same extent around the world, because actually most other societies don't have constitutions that change the world the way ours did.
Change the subject. I was rather appalled to see a survey in the last couple of weeks that only a quarter of the American adult population knows that the president has the right to fire off nuclear weapons without any supervision or confirmation from others. And I didn't get a chance this afternoon to look it up. I understand that's based on congressional action or law, 40s or 50s. Are there constitutional implications to being able to change that? Can Congress change it? Or is it involved in the executive authority of the president to wage war and protect our national security?
So those are deep and profound questions. One of the reasons, I think that Hillary Clinton had a lot of problems, but I thought she was sober and steady. And you want sobriety and steadiness, and I had doubts about Donald Trump and still do, and there's a job description for the presidency. And as a student of the presidency, I will tell you it's a national security office. Now, Congress, of course, can get rid of nuclear weapons tomorrow, and then there's no button to push. Congress could get rid of an army tomorrow. Why? So, a couple things about the presidency, a couple things about America. So, this is George Washington. It's a picture of the painting of the Washington family, and you see that Washington is our first president, in part because he's a military figure. And he's got the world at his feet, quite literally, a globe. This is you see a geostrategy here. Every elected president until Lincoln, with only one exception, is America's leading diplomat or a battlefield general before election, okay? In fact, they're all secretaries of state or battlefield generals, except John Adams. It wasn't a position of Secretary of State, but he's a leading diplomat along with Jay and Pinckney and Franklin. So Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State; James Madison, Secretary of State; James Monroe, Secretary of State; John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State; Martin Van Buren, Secretary of State; James Buchanan, Secretary of State. Secretaries of State, you see, are competent to be presidents of the United States as a general proposition. Hillary Clinton. And every single president, with one elected president before Lincoln, with one exception, is a battlefield general or a Secretary of State, in effect. It's a geostrategic position and it office, the presidency, and it remains so today. Now, what's the big difference between the founding and today? Well, one big difference. So why is America free? Because that's another reason. See, the Canadians don't really kind of free themselves, and there's a certain audacity of Americans freeing themselves, and it involves taking up arms, which requires a certain martial courage. That's actually, that top picture is the Battle of Bunker Hill. There are two versions of that picture. One, the not as nice version, is in the Capitol Rotunda. It's the big version. The much nicer, smaller version is in the Yale University Art Gallery. And the Canadians just kind of asked the British nicely, and the British accept this because Lincoln wins the Civil War and the Brits decide that they're not going to be able to recreate an empire in America. Okay? So the Canadians are free because the Americans, you see, and the Americans aren't quite free because the Canadians. So why are the Americans free? Because and these aren't my forebearers. We come very late to this story, but I can embrace this project as you all can choose to. What makes America free? Here's my claim. This is the fundamental claim of Chapter 1 of America's Constitution, a biography. America is basically free from most of our history, not because of courts. Courts are third out of 3 in the Constitution, and they don't do very much to protect liberty. And as late as 1930s, they're not doing much. We pass the First Amendment, and the courts uphold a sedition act that makes it a crime to criticize the president. That was signed by John Adams. He's a Harvard man. And then later on, during World War II, Congress passes another law that makes it a crime to criticize the government, and courts unanimously uphold that. That was signed into law by Woodrow Wilson. He's a Princeton man. So the Yaleys have a slightly better record, but not great. A Yale Law School graduate writes Plessy versus Ferguson. Don't count on the judges. Actually, don't count quite on the politicians. That's not. Eugene Victor Debs gets 1 million votes for president, and they put him in jail for 10 years for basically giving an anti-war speech. Okay? And the judges say, fine by us. So America is not free because of courts, which give us Dred Scott and Plessy. That's not why I was told that's why we were free, but that's not actually what I now believe. It's not because we have a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights isn't enforced very effectively until Hugo Black comes along. Americans are free because for the first 150 years, there's no standing army in peacetime in America. Because we have these vast oceanic moats that protect us from the rest of the world. We only need a small army, and we can trust George Washington. He's not going to make himself king. Why isn't he going to make himself king? Here's the most important thing to understand about that picture I showed you before, which is the Washington family. Who's not there? Where's Waldo? There's a big gaping emptiness in the middle. Washington has no sons to succeed him. He's not going to try to create a throne because he's got no one to give it to. That's his adopted step-grandchildren there. Washington becomes father of his country because he's not even father of his own children. This is the significance of dynasty in America, Chapter 1 of the new book. So you can trust him. He had an army and he gave it up, and he has no son to give it to. And the army is only 5,000 people. And against 3 million Americans with guns in their hands, 5,000 is going to be enough to kick the Brits out, kick the Spanish out, eventually kick the French out, kill the Indians, control the continent, and no one will mess with us. And that's, for the first 150 years, we hide behind our oceans, and that's not true anymore, you see. But as late as World War II, you see the rest of the world, massive devastation. 30 million Soviets die. Berlin reduced to rubble. Dresden firebombed. Bombs raining over Parliament building in Britain. In major cities, population centers in Japan, incinerated from the face of the earth. And here it's Pearl Harbor. 8,000 miles away from where we are, 10,000 miles away from where, across. It's not New York. It's not Washington, D.C., because of these vast oceanic moats. That's no longer, and that's why Americans were free. We had no standing army in peacetime, and that was a huge advantage. Today, you have a massive military, industrial surveillance complex. This is what Ike understood as he was leaving office, that didn't exist before. And once you have that, and nuclear weapons, and a huge army, the Constitution says every 2 years, the standing army has to be reauthorized. But now you have a massive army, and your oceans no longer, we're defending not just America, but the entire world. And the Canadians actually aren't pitching in very much, truth be told. And even, not even the French so much, truth be told. And our oceans don't protect us anymore because we have nuclear submarines 100 miles probably from where we are right now, and intercontinental ballistic missiles, and Star Wars can't actually take us back to the womb of the American Revolutionary time, and we have pandemic viruses and international terrorism. So the American constitutional system was isolationist in some very deep, important ways, and it's probably, we can't go back to that. Yeah, so the answer is, yeah, Congress tomorrow could get rid of nuclear weapons, but they're not going to do that. And as long as we have this massive military, industrial surveillance state, the president is the commander-in-chief, and he controls that vast apparatus. So we have to think very carefully about whom we pick. I did. Not all of my American. I don't know if everyone else in America, thought carefully. That's. So there you have it. No, they can't basically say Rex Tillerson is the commander-in-chief. No, they tried to do that. The radical Republicans, by which I don't mean Newt Gingrich, I mean Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens in the 1860s, tried to pass a law saying every military order has to go through General Grant rather than President Andrew Johnson, and that's unconstitutional because Andrew Johnson was the commander-in-chief, even though he's president by mere assassin's bullet, but the Constitution is pretty clear on that. And in case you missed it, I'm not a fan of the current commander-in-chief, but he's mine, but he is the president of us all, and he was duly elected.
It's almost that topic. We've got time for one more.
Do you have anything to say about the arguments and discussions about the origin of the right to carry weapons? This has been discussed a lot recently.
Yeah, keep and bear arms. So here are two pictures. The founding, and these are pictures of arms bearing in America, the founding and Reconstruction. Let me show you them again. Here's the founding. The top is the founding image, and it's the language of the Second Amendment. It's all about militias. This is look, your Constitution is a reflection of our history as a people. And our history as a people has been defined by our wars, especially by our constitutional wars, especially by the American Revolution and the Civil War. The American Revolution is a ragtag, sort of motley alliance of local rebels against an imperial center. Okay? It's Luke Skywalker and Han Solo against an evil emperor. And so it's Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. And on that top picture, which is the most famous political painting in antebellum America, see the good guys that are on your left, they're the local militia, and the jackbooted thugs, the central government, the redcoats are, death, destruction, they're in the middle under the Union Jack. So central government, central army, bad, militias, good. That's your Second Amendment vision. That's a reflection of the American Revolution. It's military. It's political. It's collective, it's localist. That's the founding. Now that's not the Constitution we have today, you see, because that Constitution failed. We call that failure the Civil War. And there's a new birth of freedom, a new way of thinking about rights in America after the American Revolution. That's the bottom picture. Do you see how the bottom picture is? This is the bottom picture, how it's a pun on the first. There's the flag of the central government in the middle. There's one black person in your far right in the top. They become a lot of black people in the bottom one. The militiamen have become Klansmen, and the uniforms have come off. But that first one is alluding to the second one, but now it's a different vision of arms bearing. This is called the Freedmen's Bureau. So here's arms bearing in America after the Civil War. The Union Army, they're the good guys, the central government, U.S. Grant. They're not jackbooted thugs, they're us. They're Tom Hanks, they're the Army. We don't think the Army is alien and other. We think he's a Pennsylvania school teacher just like us. That's a Reconstruction vision. We don't trust these militiamen anymore. They fought for freedom at Bunker Hill and they killed for slavery at Vicksburg. So militia's not so good anymore. Central government, good. This bottom picture is not military. It's civilian. The uniforms are off. It's not localist, it's nationalist. Now, rather than the flag of the central government being death and destruction, it's order, it's the Constitution. The central government in this new vision, this is not collective, it's individual, is going to protect the rights of individual black people on the right to have guns in their homes for self-protection because they can't count on the local cops, the constabulary, when the Klan comes calling. That's the modern vision. Top vision, when guns are outlawed, only the king's men will have guns. That's Second Amendment militias. Second vision, when guns are outlawed, only Klansmen will have guns. This is individuals having guns in their own homes for self-protection. Very different vision. Here's an analogy, and then I'll end. Almost everything, well, here's a global point, that you think comes from the Bill of Rights, it actually doesn't come from the Bill of Rights. It comes from Lincoln's generation, the Civil War. Here's another book. It's called The Bill of Rights, Creation and Reconstruction. It's also panoramic. It's part 1 and part 2. Old Testament, New Testament. Part 1 is Old Testament. Here's what this looks like at the founding. Part 2 is New Testament. It looks different when we add a different set of scriptures. The framers didn't call it the Bill of Rights quite, but the Reconstruction generation did. Here's an analogy. If you are Christian, you read the Old Testament through the prism of later texts. You read the book of Isaiah as if it says, a virgin shall give birth rather than a young woman shall give birth. You understand the personality of God to be not Yahweh, who is a very scary personality, by the way, but Abba, Father. You interpret earlier scriptures through the reinterpretation of a reformist rabbi named Jesus of Nazareth, who says, actually, literally it says there are these 10 commandments, but you see there's an 11th like unto it that says. Just so, we Americans, actually, what we call the Bill of Rights is really, on issue after issue after issue, more a Reconstruction understanding. Lincoln's generation gives us a new birth of freedom, a new way of understanding the Declaration of Independence's promise. Because what does Lincoln say? 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, the guy who wrote that is a slaveholder who never frees his slaves, and Lincoln's against slavery. It's a reinterpretation of old words, and that reinterpretation gets put into the Constitution in a 13th Amendment, a 14th Amendment, and a 15th Amendment, and it's that reinterpretation that actually influences, in fact, whether judges are fully conscious or not, our rights tradition in America. The best arguments for an individual right to have a gun in the home for self-protection is that the Reconstruction generation explicitly said that. Let me just give you one quote, and then I'll end. But this is actually from a statute that was adopted alongside the 14th Amendment. And here's the statute. It's called the Freedmen's Bureau Act of 1866, and that's the Freedmen's Bureau. That's from Harper's Weekly in 1866. This statute declared, quote, laws concerning personal liberty and personal security, including the constitutional right to bear arms, shall be secured to and enjoyed by all the citizens. No mention of militias. Citizens even includes women. It's a very individualistic understanding. Arms bearing no longer has sort of the same military connotation. And you can see it all if you look carefully at just these two images. The second very obviously echoing and punning on the first, even as it offers sort of a very different vision of rights in America. What's true of the Second Amendment is true of all of them. Everything that you believe about the First Amendment, a lot of it's the 14th and not just the first. That's the thesis of, there's no MOOC for this one, but the book called The Bill of Rights, Creation and Reconstruction. In effect, founding and Old Testament of creation, Reconstruction, New Testament, a different way of understanding this old text. You've been very, very patient with me and generous. This is my 5th time. God willing, there'll be a 6th if you all like. Thank you very much.